Næsta erindi fjallar markaðshorfur í áliðnaði og óvissutímum og ef við hugsum nú bara aðeins aftur hérna síðustu ár þá man ég bara hreinlega ekki eftir því að það hafi ekki verið óvissutími. Þetta svona hvaða nafni sem óvissan kann að nefnast. Við höfum Brexit, ólíkindatólið Trump, svo var það COVID og kannski það alvarlegasta öllu núna, það eru stríðsátök í Úkraínu. En Joseph Cherrez, hann sérfræðingur hjá greiningafyrirtækinu Crew og hann hingað komin. The floor is yours, Mr. Cherrez.
Good morning. The talk this morning is about the aluminium market outlook and in particular the volatility that we've seen in the market recently, our view of deficits in certain regions and what this means for Iceland and green premiums. Now, you could say that the aluminium growth story has hit some bumps in 2022. War, COVID-19 and inflation are three of those. Now, specifically, what that means is that capacity has been taken out of the European market of just under 800,000 tons due to higher power prices. That's a bullish factor. In addition, you have concerns about access to Russian material, which could become more difficult to purchase or, in fact, illegal to purchase in the event of sanctions being applied on Russia. We don't know if that will happen, but it's a concern in the market. Also a bullish factor. Now, against that, you have certain factors which are more bearish for prices. You have demand, for example, concerns, also due to inflation and higher energy prices. That's more focused in Europe. But you also have concerns around demand in China, in particular due to the lockdowns of COVID-19. And you also have Chinese production, which was a variable coming into 2022, and which has been ahead of expectations. Now, if we focus on the negative side of the story first, let's look at that demand in the short term. What we're seeing is demand growth destruction. That's how we would term it. That doesn't mean that demand is reducing, it means that the growth is reducing. So we've cut our forecasts for the rest of the world consumption from 4.3% to 2.7%, and we've cut China's consumption from 0.9 to 0.3. And if you look at the chart on the top right, you can see that China's demand in the second quarter is significantly below the year before, the reason being the lockdowns that they imposed. But you also see that it's accelerating later in the year. This is due to stimulus measures being applied by the Chinese government and also the rebound effect of opening after lockdown. Now, China is our main concern in terms of demand in the world. The construction market was already weak in China going into the year, and the lockdowns have had an effect. There is an automotive slowdown globally. That's affected China, it's affected Asia outside of China, and it's affected Europe, and it's been exacerbated by the war in Ukraine. However, it's not entirely negative. There are areas of strength. Packaging, for example, will be resilient. Solar is a growth area, and US demand is still strong. Now, as I mentioned, Chinese production was an important variable in the market coming into the year. There were estimates in the market ranging from high 30s in terms of millions of tons to the low 50s. We've been relatively consistent in terms of our estimates, but we have increased our estimate from 6.5% for the year to 3.5%. And this is on the back of faster restarts of smelters in the south of the country in Yunnan. And this itself is driven by an easing of the dual control target by China for energy consumption. Now, China has a capacity constraint, or it has a self-imposed ceiling, shall we say, on capacity of 45 million tons a year. And this is a commitment that they've given domestically and internationally not to produce more than that amount in terms of capacity. And obviously production would be less than that because they don't produce it 100%. So we expect them to abide by that as well. So even with both those bearish factors, the short-term demand and the Chinese production, we believe the world is still in deficit. in terms of aluminium, but the nature of that deficit has changed somewhat. So previously, we had a deficit of 1.6 million tons in 2021, and all of that was happening in China. The rest of the world was in balance. Now in 2022, the deficit is less, and it's much less in China, but the rest of the world is moving more into deficit, and in particular in Europe. So we have an estimate of 0.7 million tons currently for 2022 deficit, and 0.4 of that is in the rest of the world, and Europe's deficit is 1.2, and that's up from our earlier estimate of 1 million, on the back of the smelter closures that I mentioned previously. Now, obviously, a deficit is a problem. How to address that? And there are a number of important projects coming on stream. But what I would caution is that inevitably projects take longer to come on stream than one would expect. And that's especially the case in countries that have geopolitical challenges. And also, I think one can ask legitimately how much of this production is green. Certainly not as green as Iceland, we could put it like that. Now, it's important to remember as well, a critical element of the growth story of aluminium is green, and the green energy transition and ESG. I mean, historically, we've seen consumption growth of 5.2% per year over the last 20 years in aluminium, but the future of that is driven by ESG and driven by sectors that are transitioning to lighter, more sustainable, recyclable aluminium. So we're seeing potential growth of 4.7% in transportation, for example, driven by the transition to EV. We're seeing 4.2% in packaging, 3.8% in electrical. So the demand picture in the future is good, but it's important that the aluminium is sustainable. And of course, that's not to mention potential additional requirement from reconstruction in Ukraine, which we don't expect to happen, obviously, this year or next year, but eventually will consume a lot of metal, including aluminium. So how can we supply this based on current hydro and geothermal output? Well, in a nutshell, we can't. By 2031, it's expected, if the key sectors that we mentioned were to transition to even 80% sustainable aluminium, it's estimated we would have a deficit of low-carbon aluminium of almost 10 million tons currently. And we have two scenarios there which you can look at your leisure. But the short point is there is a deficit of low carbon already. But there is some good news too in relation to green premiums, which is that we believe signs are emerging that a green premium is appearing. Now, since March 9th, LME price has fallen. It topped out at over $4,000 a ton, 9th of March 2022. Since then, it's fallen by 30%. But actually, in that time, ingot premiums in Europe increased by 28%, which is a very unusual difference in terms of direction. Now, European premiums are being driven by, as we mentioned, fears relating to Russia, smelter closures, and so on. Also by anti-dumping decisions that have been taken by the EU to block certain semi-finished products produced by China, and then also driven by concerns around the removal of allowances in relation to the ETS system and the potential introduction of CBAM, which could also lead to smelter closures. So our view is that CBAM, if it's implemented, could accelerate the emergence of a green premium, and in fact, you may even say that an element of green premium exists in the European ingot premium. Now, focusing on Iceland, I believe you've seen this slide before, so we won't spend too long on it. The main point is Iceland is the greenest producer in the world. Put it like that. If not the greenest, one of the greenest. It's on the far left of the low carbon portion of the curve. Low carbon being defined as 4 tons of CO2 equivalent per metric ton of aluminium. And this is scope 1 and 2 and third-party anode purchases. So Iceland is the most sustainable and the most green. But it's not the lowest cost. And here, we're showing the average here, which is the blue line. Obviously, there are 3 smelters here. One is on the left of that. One is roughly where you see the line intersecting. One is on the right. and none of them could be considered low cost by international standards. So obviously there is a cost to perform at that level, basically. And as an additional point, Iceland smelters do not receive state aid. If you look at this chart, what it is showing basically is the state aid that has been given to smelters in different countries in relation to carbon cost embedded in power costs. This is often rebated to smelters in Europe as a way of basically avoiding them shutting down or relocating due to higher costs. Iceland doesn't receive that. So, Romania did in 2021. Holland has in the past, although it's not shown. Germany does regularly, but Iceland does not. So you could say that there is basically not a 100% level playing field between the producers in Europe. And bear in mind, that you have the most sustainable producer here who is coping with, higher costs too. So then, in conclusion, market volatility is very high due to the war in Ukraine and the risk of further sanctions against Russia. But longer term, our view is that the ESG and green demand story is 100% intact. European premiums are at a record on concerns around Russian oil and gas and energy prices. And you could say that there is an element of a green premium embedded in that as well. And low carbon aluminium deficits are possible this decade. And I guess we end on a question. Is this Iceland's moment for a step change in attitudes and to build consensus to supply more green aluminium, to support its smelters and incentivize them to do that? And we see evidence that a green premium may already be emerging. Thank you.